Okay. All right, so welcome everybody. I'm Molly Letterman, your moderator for today. And just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please remember to keep yourself on mute throughout the session. We will be saving all questions for the end, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll address them during the Q&A at the end, but we will be waiting to the end to do that. Closed captioning will be available throughout the session. Turning that on right now. And if you need any assistance, you can just put that in the chat and I'll be moderating that to help you there as well. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Julia Rodriguez, who will be talking about doing the donor dance, lessons learned from talking to donors and working with donor relations staff. Over to Julia.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, which we tested, so should work. All righty, everybody can see that. Oops. Sorry, not showing me my notes. Let's try that again. Here. We just tested this and now it's not working. 1 second, real quick. Back here. All righty. All right, are we able to see that now? Doesn't seem to be.
So we see it on the side with your speaker notes. It's showing like the speaker version.
Oh,
with the
we
next
just
slide.
tested this. Why is this doing this to me? Because we have to have some technical difficulty, right?
Always.
All right, let's try it again. Going back to here. Okay, let's try it again here. All righty, can you see my little doggy there?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
we can.
Sorry about that, everybody. We
No
did
problem.
just test that. And it's just, you know, how things work, I guess. Okay. Before it was letting me see both things at the same time. So my name is Julia Rodriguez. I am the Health Sciences and Scholarly Communications Librarian at Oakland University. And I'm also the Affordable Course Materials team lead here. And the goal of my presentation today is to have participants consider how we communicate with donors and philanthropy staff and how we manage our messaging and marketing elements and those elements that we create and how those are different from almost anything else or any other kind of outreach that we do. And hopefully you'll feel better prepared for donor outreach and be more able to effectively create marketing materials. I want to start by saying that I don't have a magic bullet or any supreme wisdom here. This knowledge is being shared as intended for novices, you know, someone who is a beginner like me and really could have used a little bit of support before the first time I started engaging with donors. So the outline for the presentation is as follows. I'm going to give you just a little context about Oakland, so you know kind of where we fit in and about our affordable initiative, and then talk about how that led into donor engagement and discuss the different elements of donor engagement with print and presentations, and then tell you a little story about outreach to donors, and then the lessons learned from that, and I'll share some resources that I have created for you. So because we're not in person, I really missed that. The one thing about this conference, this is the first OER conference that I attended, and it's really where I feel like I started learning about OER and getting engaged with OER, was the engagement with you guys and the network that happened at lunch and everything. So feel free to put into the chat how much experience that you've had with donors and any comments that you have there, and we'll look at those at the end of the session there. So a little background about OU. So Oakland University is located in Rochester Hills, Auburn Hills. It's in the Detroit metro area, if you're not familiar. We have approximately 20,000 students. We're considered to be a R2 institution. We have 70% of our students are from Oakland or Macomb County, and 12% of those students live on campus or residential. 75% of our full-time undergraduates receive some sort of scholarships or grants. 86% of the FIDIACs get scholarships and grants. And then we have 43% of our full-time undergraduates who are getting needs-based help. So of that group, 43% are getting that because there's needs-based. And we've been told that about 50% of our graduates are actually transfer students into OU, and that our students graduate with about $26,000 of debt. Jump too far there. So the Affordable Initiative at OU started in 2017 as a task force out of the College of Arts and Sciences. And that led to the development of a campus plan, which was accepted by our provost initially in February of 2019. And we received $5,000 sometime that year as seed money for our pilot stipend program. We had no further engagement with the provost office at that point. The pilot stipend program was pretty successful, and we had a presentation with several participants during our OE week, which actually happened remotely because of COVID. And at that presentation that we had a number of donors that were connected to the library, and so they were very excited about the initiative and encouraged the library to do a library day of giving that the university does every year, focused around the Affordable Initiative. So we did that, a library day of giving for our Affordable Initiative after that. That allowed us to do another round of stipends in winter of 2021. And then in the summer of 2021, we were able to quietly kind of launch our zero and low cost course markings initiatives in partnership with the registrar's office. And then in fall of 21, we saw lots of activity. The Student Congress re-engaged with this issue, and they called on the administration to fund and support the program. And in winter 22, the provost announced the creation of our Affordable Education Materials Gift Fund and support for our Affordable Course Materials Initiative. So before I move on, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things within that long list of activities that some of you might feel it sounds a little bit familiar, particularly the repetition of the events. So you'll see here that in 2018, our Student Congress passed a resolution in support of OER, in which they presented to our Board of Trustees. And things went pretty quiet after that. Those students moved on, and we had some but not very effective engagement with their replacements. And in fall of 2021, the newly elected Student Congress became very engaged, and they passed a new resolution in support of our official Affordable Initiative, and even pledged some funds, which we were previously told they couldn't do. And they had very focused leadership that took some very public action, which I'll talk more about in a minute. You'll also notice the little frowny face there in the middle. We had little to no activity or outreach at all for almost a year because of the COVID pandemic. And during that time, the team that I had assembled sort of dissolved, and some people had actually left the university. You may notice that our provost endorsed the initiative both in 2019 and 2022. So we had one provost leave the institution, and he took his associate provost with him. And so he basically was wiping out a lot of institutional knowledge and outreach that we had done. And so in 2020, basically had to start with a new provost office and essentially do a re-education campaign. So while our original task force and report was focused specifically on OER, the Affordable Initiative that came out of that work was deliberately designed to be very broad. And so based on a lot of campus conversations, we came up with this pathway towards transitioning courses to affordable. And OER is seen as a goal, but there was support put in place for faculty who want to transition to courses in other ways, like using library materials. So as I mentioned, our students really re-engaged with this affordable initiative in the fall of 21. And I had reached out to the New Student Congress to share some survey data that we had collected prior to the COVID work from home. And it strongly suggested that our faculty rarely heard from our students about not being able to purchase textbooks. I believe that their strong re-engagement is due to the fact that the New Student Congress president is a campus activist who had previously taken on the administration regarding student working conditions during the pandemic. And he quickly launched a campus campaign that included a public petition, and he called for the administration to fund the initiative. He also invited faculty who had received stipends and student leaders to write letters to the editor of the student newspaper. So you can see some of that there on the slide. I share all this history with you because this is the impetus for a very quick uptick in engagement and fundraising for the initiative. So from these activities, it resulted in me receiving a number of requests. Not only did I get what was reached out to from one of the newly appointed provosts, and I say one because we now have 3 to replace the one that left. They contacted me and we had a series of meetings that ultimately led to the provost re-endorsing the initiative and publicly encouraging our faculty to use OER and affordable materials. The provost also announced the creation of the library's affordable education gift fund, which had already been in the works for a little bit of time prior to that. With the creation of the new fund, our student volunteers who answered the calls at our telephone office needed to be properly informed about the initiative. So I met with that group. And now it's just one of those things that kind of happens that you don't really plan for. So out of the blue on an afternoon, I get this email from the supervisor for those students. And I honestly never thought about they existed, right? But now that there was this new fund, they were getting questions and they didn't know what this was. And so I had to very quickly come up with a way to do some outreach to them so they understood when they're answering calls, what exactly this means. I also was interviewed by the student newspaper. And again, these are things that happen like really fast because they're responding to some of the events about the provost announcement. And then I was encouraged by the administration to submit grants to local groups, which I did, although none of those were funded. The big to-do that came out of that direct push from the students was that I was invited to present to a group of donors at the president's house and what is known as a salon dinner. And this is the first event that was sponsored by the president at her house for the library. And because of the success of the salon dinner, I was invited to present to our Golden Grizzly Summit. This is a very large meeting of all the boards for the university of over 100 people, and including the deans and the philanthropy staff. So in this, all of these flurry of events, we have print material and we have materials that I made for presentations that were face-to-face. And none of those things that I had already created really fit with some of this outreach that I was being asked to do. And so one of the first things that we did create was a Day of Giving brochure. So I'll just speak briefly about the print materials, but I'm going to focus mainly on doing presentations. But our Day of Giving is an event that the university has, and each unit picks their topic in which they're going to focus their one day of giving for donors. And so for the last 2 years, the library has focused their Day of Giving on the affordable initiative. And so a large glossy brochure was created for that. Prior to that, all of the outreach materials that were created for the initiative were created by me and the team. And this one was created by the philanthropy staff and the campus marketing team. And so this type of print material has some advantages. It has enough room to include context and background and stories. But in print, the wording and the phrases become very important. And so a few things that I encountered as we developed this new outreach piece was that the philanthropy staff and the campus marketing team changed the title of the Affordable Course Materials Initiative, which I admit is a very large mouthful, to simply Affordable Education. And while that seems very simple, and it aligns with the campus fund that we have, all of the other marketing materials that I have and the website say the Affordable Course Materials Initiative. The first edition of this brochure, we had some quotes from faculty from the stipend program, but that was all we had to illustrate stories. For the second edition, they pulled examples from the statements from the letters of the editors that I mentioned earlier that the faculty had written. And in one case, they used the header on the top that said, faculty use open educational resources, but the story that they highlighted was of a faculty member who used low cost resources and not OER. And I had to go back and forth and be very clear about why there is a difference, and we had to not use that header. We had to change the header. There was also a strong push for me to provide solid savings and impact statements, not just from what we've already done, but what a very specific pledge could do for us in the future. And I'm sure, as all of you know, this can be really tricky. We initially created the brochure. When we initially created the brochure, we had just wrapped up our pilot stipend program, and it did provide us confidently with some figures, but I still had to go back and forth and really tweak the language several times to feel that we are accurately stating what we knew and what was, potentially possible. If we think about presenting to donors, it's probably true that you have many different versions of presentations that you use for talking to different audiences. So, you talk to librarians or faculty or administrators or students, and so you have different versions of presentations. But when it came to putting a presentation together for donors, none of these presentations that I had really worked. Maybe elements of them did, but not as a presentation as a whole. And I really didn't understand how different these audiences were until I had a chance to present to them. Right. And so hence, that's why I'm doing this presentation, is that I hope that there's a little bit of guidance in here that you will have that I didn't have about how to reframe our message and the things that we should consider when we're doing that. And so, some of the things that really have struck me is that, our audience is familiar with the university, but they may not be so familiar that they understand the courses or the teaching techniques or the policies and procedures on campus. You typically are going to have a shortened time frame to talk to them. You may not have the longer length of a workshop or something that you have done in the past. And that the donor relations staff are really going to closely monitor or control the events and the interactions that you have. They want to know the big picture and not so much the details, right? So I often talk a lot in details with faculty and even students, but the donors want to know a big picture. They're interested in what other local comparable institutions are doing. So I've been asked that. And if you've ever heard the term sister institutions, you should learn who your sister institutions are. And they want to feel connected to a project. They want to know that they're having an impact. And they also are going to want a specific ask. So they want to hear clearly very articulated needs and what it takes to get to those results. So if you're like me, you tend to include research and charts and graphs and discussions about how OER can assist or impact teaching and pedagogy. And you're going to want to show examples of other projects and probably examples of open textbooks. And you're going to want to include all of the charts that emphasize your point. And you definitely want to include the video that the students made, right? You want to put all of that into a presentation because it's all very impactful. But what donors want are stories, or what I should really say is what they need are stories. They need successes and concrete statements about needs and impact. And our typical presentations that we're doing include this, but not in the same way. And what I was looking at is that I was spending a lot of time in the weeds and less time in the very concrete, high-level discussions. I was talking about what we've done and maybe where we're going, but not so much about the future needs in my presentations. So I had to learn how to switch from teaching about OER and selling open textbooks to faculty as high-quality alternatives, and to telling stories and using numbers and talking about how donors can make an impact on students. And we were fortunate to have some numbers and some stories, but the numbers we had can only tell one kind of story. And so to tell effective stories, you need to collect the right data, right? You need to determine how best to present that data. And we have all struggle with how to capture and communicate savings, right? So savings is one type of story that we're going to tell. And how do we communicate that? How do we capture that data? And what formula do we use? And how do we present the return on investment, right? So return on the, ROI, which is what, all the donors are going to want to know, is a term that you're going to need to be very familiar with. And so some of the data we had was helpful with donors, but the long tail of return is where it became a little difficult. And the desire for donors to see a quick progress and to see their dollars making an impact and was really challenging, right? Especially since in the early on, we were in very early stages. Our second round of stipends had a 16-month plus gap between the call for stipends and the completion. And so donors want updates. The timeline that we have in our academic calendar is different than what maybe donors want or are accustomed to, right? And they want to see some sort of progress and have reports back that might just not be what's typical for an academic schedule. So just as important as the data, obviously, is the stories, right? So we also need to gather those stories from faculty and students. And these were harder to get. We had some faculty stories that came with the feedback from our stipend program, and some were shared in the letters to the editor as part of the student campaign, but we hadn't systematically collected this information. This was pulled from we did pull together, and the quote here that you see here, from a report from Professor Erin Druin, who was an associate history professor from the stipend program for the very first pilot stipend program. And she applied to convert her Civil War and Reconstruction course, which used 3 textbooks costing students between $90 and $559 each semester, depending on how they purchased the textbooks. In the fall of 2020, she had 26 students enrolled in her course. And so she had a student savings of roughly between $2,000 and $14,000. And so that number that we ultimately are using is looking at the textbook, if they were, the lowest price in the bookstore and the highest price in the bookstore. And we had to very much explain and at least quantify where the number is that we're using, and that it only applies to the first semester in which she converts a course. She was so inspired by what she had the work that she had done, that she actually converted an additional course that she wasn't paid for the stipend. And so she was able to then convert 2 courses. So we got 2 courses for the price of 1 as a stipend. And it was a smaller course, but it had, as far as pricing, it cost $25 to $33 for her course material, but it had 51 students. And as we know, then every semester after that, she will continue to use those resources. She's going to be saving students money. The other thing that we have found that we struggle with is the feedback from the faculty that they give us in our faculty report. We're not really asking, we're asking for how that went, but we haven't asked the right questions to maybe get the stories that we need to communicate to donors. And so, she communicated on the screen about what the students had said, but she also said separately, in a quote that, that she felt that using the materials keeps her courses adaptive and new and fresh, and that she was able to feel that the courses that she's been teaching for over a decade were fresh for her, and that she found new materials that excited her, and share experiences about how her teaching changed, right? So there was a lot of comments that we saw in some of the feedback forms, but not all, that we could pull out and use as stories, but we hadn't thought ahead of time how to collect those. The other thing that was difficult was to get stories from students. So that was a lot more difficult, and really more difficult was how to collect stories on how the stipend program had impacted students. So we could, of course, pull together stories about how prices of textbooks impact students generally, right? There's a lot of data on that. And we even had some quotes, as you see here, from a previous Open Ed Week event, where we had asked students to write on postcards and tell us about the impact of textbook prices for them. But we hadn't considered at any point how to get data from students about the impact of, that course being converted. So we did have some students that said, oh yeah, it's great that the textbook was free, at the end of the course, but we hadn't been systematic in the way in which we were collecting that. And we really wanted to hear how converting the course or the use of OER had really impacted them. I did reach out to student council for assistance, but we weren't able to get what we were looking for in a short amount of time before the first big donor event that we had. And thinking to the future, this is something that we really are going to look to include in ways that faculty can do that with their end of semester assessment or as part of an OE week event. So another learning curve was exactly how donor engagement events work. If you haven't had the opportunity to be part of one or be invited to go on, you think you kind of know how it's going to work, but then when it actually happens, things may go a little differently. So I'm sure that each institution is unique in how in which you would engage with your philanthropy office or whatever the office is called. But I imagine that there are some similarities as well. So we have a director of philanthropy for the library specifically, and she reports to her boss, who is the VP of philanthropy, and he has all sorts of staff that do different aspects of event planning. So the library director of philanthropy had the knowledge of the donors that were connected to the library, but she didn't have so much knowledge about the other donors, which were invited by the VP of philanthropy separate from her. So at the first event, there were several things that I wished I had known or had been better prepared for. And these seemed pretty straightforward, but I hadn't thought to ask beforehand, or I didn't feel comfortable asking maybe. So, who was in charge of what, right? There's these staff, there's lots of different staff members that touched at some point with me with the philanthropy office, and they all had different roles. And some of them were organizing the dinner, and some of them were running the narrative, and some of them were talking to donors. And so, who's in charge of what? And another thing that seems very obvious, but what's the overarching goal of the evening? And how are we going to decide that, right? And what do we have the liberty to talk about? And what shouldn't I say, right? So there's when you're talking with donors, depending on the events and the situations, that there's going to be some what I call gated communication. And what is our ask? And who is doing that? So what are we asking of these particular donors at this event, and who's going to be doing that asking? So I'm going to tell a brief story in demonstration of the power of storytelling to help connect with an audience. And so you can kind of see how I learned this as a newbie going into my first donor relations activity. And this was the result of the student petition, as I mentioned, and the outreach campaign that they did resulted in a special dinner called a salon dinner to be scheduled at the president's house. And so salon dinners are a small dinner of 20 or so people that are invited to the president's house over one topic that they're going to talk about. And I said it happened at the president's house, which is called Sunset Terrace. And if you're not familiar with the building, it's a pretty well-known building. Was the retirement home of Alfred and Matilda Wilson, and it's modeled after the houses designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in the Prairie Home design. It has a 40-foot round living room, which is intended to host about 200 guests. And the dining room is in like a horseshoe shape. So the picture here is the living room where I did my presentation, and that round shape that you see there. For the salon dinner, we had 3 prep meetings, and we talked about who's coming and where they were sitting and whether we were having one table or 2. And the table topic was a big topic, got talked about a lot, partially because of COVID. This was May, so we were pretty far along, but we still wanted to make sure people were comfortable. So they talked a lot about tables. These meetings were mostly with the donor event planning staff. And then we had one meeting with the president and the VP of philanthropy. And during this meeting, I gave a broad overview of what I was going to be presenting. I didn't receive any feedback other than it was suggested that we get student stories to share. And marketing set me up with a recording service that the students could submit their videos to, like capture little videos of themselves and submit those stories to. but that happened only a few weeks before the event, which was also finals week. So hence we didn't get any student story submissions. I did use quotes that we gathered from the Open Ed Week that you saw on the previous slide. And even though I had reached out to Student Congress, with the event happening so close to finals, we weren't able to do that, but I was able to look at a survey that they had some student quotes in it, and you'll see those popping up elsewhere in the presentation. But without those two pieces, without their survey, where I was able to look through and get some quotes, and our previous event where I had to go and find those actual cards in my office, we wouldn't have had any student stories to include in my presentation. The event started with cocktails and mingling, and I don't drink, and I didn't really mingle because when I got there, I realized the unique nature of the room, and I needed to determine how I was both going to see my slides that were going to be on the projector and my audience, and also see my notes that I luckily had printed out, so I didn't need to actually look at the projector, the computer, while it was projecting. We had dinner, and the presentation was to take place between dinner and dessert. And we went to they went with a 2-table design. And so which allowed additional space between the people would feel more comfortable with that. And I sat at the table with the director of philanthropy, and my dean sat at the other table with the president, and the donors were split between 2 tables. And at our table, there was no conversation about the evening's topic during dinner. After dinner, I gave a 20-minute presentation, which was a very strange auditory experience because when you stood in the middle of that round room, your voice sounded like it was reverberating around the room in a circle. And I also, my kids and I had printed out some of those student quotes and pasted them onto note cards, and I was going to pass those out to donors and have them read it to kind of engage them in the presentation. And I had forgotten them at home. So I was able to at least read those from the screen, so that was good. But despite my experience in the presentation, the audience actually was really engaged, and they quickly jumped in afterwards with really good questions and wanting to know what we were asking for. During the entire planning process for the evening, I had relied on the library's director of philanthropy and the library's dean to provide guidance and strategy, and they were very passive. They deferred mostly to the VP of philanthropy, and we never strategized together about the fundraising goals or coordinated possible responses to donor questions about needs. All of the meetings, in all of the meetings, there weren't any discussions of how conversations would go or what our plan of attack was. So when I was approached by a kind donor after the presentation, I felt like I was treading water. I was asked very straightforward questions, but I was not able to answer them, and I didn't want to turn her away. She also thanked me for getting in the weeds in my presentation, and I had thought that I had pulled all the weeds out and had been a little bit more high level, so that was interesting. The dinner ran long, and I wasn't able to attend the dessert because I'm a single parent and I had to go pick up my kids. And I found myself going over in my head a number of things about the night that I wished had gone differently. We should have been more proactive as a unit in our meetings with the VP of philanthropy and determining our approach for the evening. We need to have, really outlined our goals and what the ask was that we wanted to communicate to the donors and a plan for who was doing that. I also wish that I had a written document about the donors present, who were either at my table or all of the donors that were present that I could have referred to during the event. So I was told about who they were beforehand in a meeting, but I didn't have anything to refer to. And I should have assumed that the event would go long and just get childcare ahead of time. I've put together just some key takeaways to consider. So on the next slide, I'll talk more about I'll show you the donor presentation template that I created. But when we're thinking about print materials, you're typically going to have more room to define a project, and you're going to be listing high-level goals. There'll be lots of language and messaging tweaking to make everyone happy. So, while it will seem sort of straightforward, you will find yourself, struggling over literally 2 or 3 words in this entire pamphlet to make sure it's saying what it should say, and everybody's happy with the way it's presented. When you're thinking about presenting directly to donors, you need to keep in mind that they are super supporters of the university, and they want to make us great, but they want a clear picture of how we get there. Donors want regular updates. They want to see progress, perhaps faster than maybe possible to show it to them. Donors may be interested in targeting specific groups. So we had donors interested in giving to specific departments. And that was something that people had approached me with that hadn't been discussed prior to our event. And so, do I say yes to that? Can I say yes to that? We have decided to do that, but that does complicate things, and it can complicate budgeting and planning. And be sure to come up with a consensus on the goals of the event that you're attending. And obviously that's going to change for every event, but between you and the fundraising staff, right? And to know whose role is what, who's doing what. So obviously when you're working with donors, you're working with philanthropy staff or donor relations staff, and they have different roles as well. And so, to make sure that it's clear about who's in what role, who can be asked, who can be having to ask or having those conversations with the donors is going to really help you. And then you want to just get detailed information about the donors beforehand, whether it's in writing or some other way that you might want to refer to as you're going through the event. Because if it's a longer event, then it might help as the conversation's going on, if you can refer to it and know a little knowledge about that person, like, oh, they're very interested in this. So you can kind of steer the conversation that way. So as part of this, I said, because I had nothing that I felt in my marketing folder, wheel bag there, that I could have pulled out as a presentation that worked for donors. I pulled lots of pieces, and presentation went through many steps. And even when I shared my presentation with the philanthropy staff, I got no real constructive feedback about this is too much, this is too much in the weeds, or we need more of this. I decided to put together a little template. Again, this is completely my take on that, but I thought if it's a place to start, I have a URL there, and my slides are linked in the sketch. So if you click on my slides, you'll be able to get to all of these links. But it just gives a general outline of where you can start. And it gives some examples of where, the stories and the different ways in which you can start building a presentation that's not 45 minutes long, like you're talking to faculty in a workshop, but within a 10 or 15 minutes, what can we talk about? You should also plan now to collect the stories from students and faculty of the successes and the concrete statements and the impact that you may need later. You want to build these into your program and events. And so that is really, for me, one of the big takeaways. And, had this developed slowly, I may have had some of this before, but this kind of came to us in the fact that the students started this campaign, and it kind of had this snowball effect of all of these other things happening. And the administration felt that a good way to support us was to connect us with donors. And so then a lot of activities just started to come at us, and we weren't necessarily had all of the pieces that I felt we needed in place to then jump in and do all of those things right away. And so this is one of those quotes that I was able to pull up from the student survey that they had shared with us to just kind of give the impact about textbooks and college in general, but we didn't have quotes about the program specifically. And so this is where I get to the point where I ask you all to share, because I think time permits, if I'm looking at the time, any stories or reflection or funny tidbits that you have from working with donors, and you can unmute to do that, or you can put it in the chat. I'm going to try to put this here so I can see everybody.
Oh, sure. Thanks so much. We have one question already in the chat.
Okay, great.
Could you describe your stipend program for instructors?
Oh, I sure could. Again, I wasn't sure if I should get in the weeds or not get in the weeds, right? So yeah, the stipend program at Oakland, and I can actually pull up a link to that if I can talk and do that at the same time. It's changed over time, as most people probably have had that happen. So, we have 3 different categories that we allow. I guess maybe I can't talk and do that at the same time. Oh, quick here. So if I pull this up, you'll be able to kind of watch this with me as I talk about it. Come on, chat. There we are. So that's the link to our LibGuide on the Affordable Initiative, and there's a place there for stipends. And so we're now going into a 4th round of stipends. And we basically put out a call. We have, faculty apply through an application, and they're allowed to apply to convert courses, to adopt or adapt to a, from a traditional textbook to an open textbook or OER components. We also this year tweaked it to because we had a little bit more money to allow them to develop open content. So we hadn't done that in the previous 2 because we just didn't have very much money to give out. And then the 3rd one was the Revision Innovate grant, which is where most faculty apply for. And that's where they're possibly moving from a textbook, going to a book in our ebook collection or library readings or some other type of content, a combination of content. So we have 3 different types of stipends that we've given out. And I said a lot of the faculty tend to apply for that Revision Innovate grant, but not all. And you can see the criteria listed there on the website. And it's usually about a year process. So we put out the call in February, and we let people know if they have it. And honestly, the last 2 calls we've funded all of them because we only got 4 or 5 applications, and we were able to do that. And then they work over the summer and fall, depending on how much time they need. And then they implement for either fall or winter. And then they have to write a report back to us the semester after they have implemented. And so we ask them to do a little bit of assessment. It's not, we don't dictate what that is, but some people are very thorough on the assessments. Some people a little less so on that. And so that's how it's worked for us. We'll be doing another call in the winter term. I had decided that doing them both terms is too difficult to do that. If there's something I missed, please ask, for me to elaborate.
And there's another comment in the chat. So when you're translating money into what donors connect with, it's a really important skill. Students connect to rent, housing, and food. College administrators might connect to course credit costs. Community donors might connect to minimum wage. And Rick gave an example of a Lumen calculator example. How did you do this at your institution? Like try to tailor the money into what donors connect with to your particular audience?
We said because we had some exact courses that we could show, like this course converted from using this cost of a textbook and it impacted this many students. That return on investment, all of our stipends were funded with $5,000 for each round. So it was only a $5,000 investment, and then we could show the progressive savings on that. It was easy. It was like they all said this is kind of a no-brainer, right? The issue then came up is that we had donors, particularly the story I told you was the first event, but then the other event where I went and I talked to donors across campus, they were for each different school. And so they then did want to start talking specific to their group, what can we do in business, or what can we do in just history, right? And how can we do that? And so there are things that we just have to work through with both the donor and the department if that comes up, but we didn't have to work too hard to connect donors to it. They got it. They saw the impact on our students right away. I hope that answered the question.
I think it did. Are there any other questions people have or any things that they'd like Julia to elaborate on?
You can see in my slides like what charts I used. So I've left it all in there, and that I can link that too if people don't want to click directly on the and everybody's going to want to use their own charts and graphs or whatever, but I left the ones in there that I used. Here's my template presentation, copy link. You know, so what did I show them? The cost of rising cost of textbooks. You know, I tried to focus it obviously on the campus specifically, because that's always been something that I've been asked in the past. And so what are the costs of textbooks for our students? You'll see I have a chart in there, you know, so obviously if you were to use my template, you would pull that out and put a chart for your campus. But that's what I tried to do. I had to be careful. Like I said, you want to put all these charts and graphs and talk about the cost of education and the inflation and all of this stuff, but you have 15 minutes, maybe 20 tops if you're lucky.
Any other questions that people have? Okay, well, I know this is the last session of the day, so we've all had a lot to think about and ruminate on. So if there aren't any additional questions, thank you so much, Julia. This was great. I think we all took away a lot of great ideas on working with donors, especially because I know there were a lot of people who said that they hadn't worked with donors before. So thank you so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, and we'll see you here tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.